A millionaire takes a homeless girl home, thinking it's just a one-night act of kindness. But when she hums a lullaby that hasn't echoed in his ears for years, his entire world begins to unravel. A teddy bear, a crayon drawing, a name he never thought he'd hear again. She's not just any child. She might be the one person who can break through his cold, lonely heart, and the daughter he never knew he had. But if he tells her the truth, will she forgive the man who abandoned her mother? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. On a cold winter morning, the city skyline stood dusted with snow like powdered sugar on dark bread. People moved briskly along the sidewalks, bundled in thick coats and scarves, their breath forming little clouds in the frigid air. Meanwhile, inside a sleek, glass-covered high-rise that pierced the gray sky, Richard Dalton began another day as a powerful, emotionally isolated millionaire. Richard straightened his silk tie as he gazed out from his corner office. The city below looked small, just how he liked it. He checked his platinum watch, 8:45 a.m. The board meeting would start in 15 minutes. His phone buzzed. "Mr. Dalton, your car is ready for tonight," his assistant's voice announced, and Elena called to confirm she's preparing the penthouse for your return. "Fine," Richard replied, his voice clipped and cold as the weather outside. Across town, in a gleaming boardroom with floor-to-ceiling windows, Richard sat at the head of a long mahogany table. His face showed no emotion as a young executive named James nervously presented his proposal. "This homeless shelter initiative would not only help the community, but improve our company image," James explained, his hands slightly trembling as he pointed to his charts. "The cost is minimal compared to—" "No," Richard cut him off. The single word fell like an ice cube into still water. "This company isn't a charity. Next item." The room went silent. No one dared challenge Richard Dalton. His cold blue eyes scanned the faces around him, daring anyone to speak up. No one did. His wealth was unmatched in the city, but so was his loneliness, though he'd never admit it even to himself. Miles away, little Lonnie Carter sat huddled at a decrepit bus stop, her small body shivering in the freezing cold. Her brown fingers clutched a worn teddy bear missing one eye. Snow collected on her wool hat, and her shoes were soaked through. Still, she softly hummed a lullaby to herself. Ariel's song, the one her mother used to sing before she got sick. "It's okay, Mr. Buttons," she whispered to her teddy bear. "Someone will come soon." Back at his penthouse, Elena Vargas moved efficiently through the spacious rooms, turning down the crisp bed sheets and setting out fresh towels. She paused at the large family portrait on the wall, Richard standing alone, his expression stern. Elena sighed and continued her preparations, knowing her employer would return as he always did, alone and untouchable. That night, Richard's black luxury car glided through the snowy streets. He stared at his phone, barely noticing the world outside until a red light forced the car to stop. Something caught his eye, a small figure curled up under the bus stop bench, nearly buried in fresh snow. It was a child, a little girl. "Keep driving when the light changes," Richard instructed his driver automatically. But as the light turned green, he heard it, a soft, familiar melody drifting through the night. The little girl was humming a tune he hadn't heard in years, a tune that pierced through his carefully constructed armor. "Wait," he said, surprising himself. "Stop the car." Against his better judgment, Richard opened the door and stepped into the swirling snow, moving toward the bus stop where Lonnie lay curled up, wet and shivering, still softly murmuring her mother's song. Later that day, Richard's penthouse elevator doors slid open. He stepped out awkwardly, his expensive leather shoes squeaking against the marble floor. Behind him came Lainey, her small hand reluctantly holding his fingertips, her other arm clutching her teddy bear tightly to her chest. "Elena," Richard called out, his voice echoing through the spacious entryway. Elena Vargas appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Her eyes widened at the sight of the small child standing beside her employer. "Mr. Dalton?" she asked, her gaze fixed on Lonnie's shivering form. The little girl's clothes were damp, her hair matted against her forehead. "I found her at a bus stop," Richard explained stiffly. It's temporary, just for tonight. Elena didn't wait for more explanation. She immediately knelt down to Lonnie's level, her warm brown eyes taking in the child's condition. "Hello, sweetheart," she said softly. "You must be freezing. Let's get you warmed up." Lonnie looked up at Elena with cautious eyes but didn't pull away when the older woman gently touched her shoulder. "I want no drama about this," Richard said firmly, stepping back as if to distance himself from the situation. "I'll call social services first thing in the morning." Elena nodded but was already guiding Lonnie toward the bathroom. "I'll run her a warm bath. Poor thing is soaked to the bone." Richard retreated to his office, closing the door behind him. Through the walls, he could hear Elena's gentle voice and the sound of running water. 30 minutes later, Elena had transformed Lonnie. The little girl sat at the kitchen island wrapped in one of Richard's t-shirts that hung like a dress on her tiny frame. Her hair was towel-dried and neatly combed, and she spooned chicken soup into her mouth while Elena watched with a tender smile. "Is this your granddaughter, Mr. Dalton?" Elena asked when Richard finally emerged from his office. "No," he answered sharply. "As I said, I found her abandoned. It's a matter for the authorities." Elena's lips tightened slightly. "She hasn't said much, but her name is Lonnie. That's all I could get from her." Richard nodded distractedly, pouring himself a glass of scotch. "Fine. She can use the guest room tonight." "Mr. Dalton," Elena began carefully, "perhaps we should—" "It's temporary, Elena," he cut her off. "Don't get attached." Elena took a deep breath but didn't argue further. Instead, she turned her attention back to Lonnie, who had finished her soup. "Would you like some hot chocolate, Lonnie?" she asked. The little girl nodded, a small smile finally appearing on her face. As Elena prepared the hot chocolate, Lonnie began to hum softly to herself. It was a gentle, lilting melody that filled the quiet kitchen. Richard froze mid-sip. The glass in his hand trembled slightly as the familiar tune reached his ears. It was the same lullaby that Ariel Bennett, his college sweetheart, used to hum when they were together all those years ago. He stared at Lonnie in disbelief, his face suddenly pale. "What is that song?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Lonnie stopped humming and looked up at him with innocent eyes. "Mommy's song," she said simply. Richard set his glass down with a shaky hand. It's just a coincidence," he muttered to himself, but his usual composure had cracked. He turned away, visibly shaken, and walked quickly back toward his office. Elena watched him go, her eyes narrowing with curiosity and concern. At sunrise, golden light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Richard's bedroom. He awoke with a start, his silk sheets tangled around him. Sleep had been fitful, filled with vivid dreams he couldn't escape. Dreams of Ariel. In his restless slumber, he'd been transported back 20 years. Ariel Bennett, with her wild curly hair and paint-splattered overalls, laughing as she dragged him to an outdoor concert on campus. The ambitious finance major and the free-spirited art student, an unlikely pair that somehow fit perfectly together. "You need to live a little, Richard," Dream Ariel had said, her eyes dancing with mischief. "Not everything can be calculated on a spreadsheet." Richard sat up in bed, rubbing his face. He could still see her so clearly, the way she'd dance in the rain, how she'd spend hours perfecting a painting, her soft humming as she worked, the same melody Lonnie had hummed last night. He shook his head. Coincidence. It had to be. Richard pulled on his robe and headed to his study. Work would clear his mind. It always did. He was halfway through his first email when he heard a small sound at the doorway. Lonnie stood there, barefoot in the oversized t-shirt Elena had dressed her in, clutching a piece of paper. "Good morning, sir," she said softly, the formal address sounding strange from such a young child. Richard nodded stiffly. "Elena will be up soon to make you breakfast." Lonnie padded across the room, stopping at his desk. With solemn ceremony, she placed the paper in front of him. "I made this for you. It's your penthouse," she said, stumbling over the word. Richard looked down at a colorful crayon drawing. Bold strokes depicted a tall building with large windows. At the top, a stick figure man stood alone, colored in black and gray. Beside the building, A bright yellow sun beamed down. Something caught in Richard's throat. When was the last time anyone had given him a gift with no agenda? "Thank you," he muttered, unsure what else to say. Lonnie smiled, revealing a gap where a baby tooth had fallen out. "You're welcome, sir." The word sir bothered him for reasons he couldn't articulate. You can call me Richard," he said awkwardly. "Richard," she repeated carefully. "That was my daddy's name too. Mommy told me." Richard felt his stomach drop. "Your mother, what was her name?" Before Lonnie could answer, Elena appeared in the doorway. "There you are, Pequeña. Come, let's make some pancakes while Mr. Dalton works." Lonnie obediently turned to follow Elena but paused to wave at Richard. He found himself raising his hand in response. In the kitchen, Elena glanced at the phone. She'd dialed the number for social services earlier but hung up before completing the call. Something about this child's presence felt significant. The way Mr. Dalton looked at her with confusion, yes, but also with something deeper. Elena measured flour into a bowl, watching as Lonnie carefully arranged strawberries into a smiley face. "Lonnie, sweetheart," Elena asked casually, "what was your mommy's name?" "Ariel," Lonnie answered, popping a strawberry into her mouth. "She went to heaven." Elena's hand stilled on the whisk. She needed more time to understand what was happening here. Social services could wait another day. After a while, the temporary arrangement stretched on. Each morning, Richard would announce, "We'll figure this out tomorrow." And each tomorrow became another day with Lonnie under his roof. The weekend deadline he'd initially set approached, then quietly passed without mention. Elena noticed the small changes first, how Richard's eyes would linger on Lonnie's drawings taped to the refrigerator, how he'd pause in the doorway when she was humming to herself. One morning, Richard emerged from his bedroom to find Lonnie walking down the hallway with exaggerated strides, shoulders squared, chin lifted high. She was mimicking his walk perfectly. "What are you doing?" he asked, startled by the miniature reflection of his mannerisms. Lonnie giggled. "Being important like you." Richard felt his face flush. Was that how others saw him? Stiff and self-important? The drawings evolved too. First simple stick figures, then more detailed renderings. Richard at his desk, Richard by the window, Richard with a hint of a smile. She left them on his nightstand, his desk, even tucked into his briefcase. Each one signed with a wobbly, "Love Laney," that made his chest tighten. Thursday evening found Richard at the annual Dalton Foundation Gala, surrounded by the city's elite. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead as waiters circulated with champagne and canapes. "Richard, wonderful turnout," said Margaret Wellington, a board member. "I've been meaning to discuss the shelter initiative with you." Richard sipped his drink. The foundation's focus this quarter is on educational grants. "But surely there's room to expand," Margaret pressed. "The homeless children in this city need parents who make better choices," Richard cut in coldly. "Our resources are allocated where they can make measurable impact." Margaret's smile faltered. "I see. Well, do watch the presentation. Might change your mind." Richard barely listened until the lights dimmed and a video began playing on the large screen. Statistics about childhood homelessness flashed across the screen, followed by images of children. His glass nearly slipped from his fingers when a little girl appeared. Not Lonnie, but similar enough to make his heart race. Same solemn eyes, same gentle demeanor. "Many of these children have lost parents to illness, addiction, or circumstance," the narrator explained. Richard excused himself abruptly, leaving confused murmurs in his wake. Back at the penthouse, he found Elena folding laundry after putting Laney to bed. "I need to know who she is," he said without preamble. Elena's hand stilled on a small pink shirt. "Senor?" "Lonnie. Her mother's name was Ariel?" His voice caught. "Ariel Bennett?" "That's what she told me," Elena confirmed quietly. "She said her mother went to heaven." Richard paced the room. This can't be coincidence. The song she hums, it was Ariel's song. Perhaps you should ask Lainey. No, Richard interrupted. I'm calling Marcus Bennett. Your investigator friend? Elena asked cautiously. Richard nodded, already dialing. Marcus, I need you to trace someone for me. A child named Lainey Carter, possibly connected to Ariel Bennett from my university days. Yes, it's urgent. He hung up and stared out at the city lights. The wall he'd built around his past was beginning to crumble, and he wasn't sure if he was ready for what might be revealed. Earlier that day, 6 months earlier, snow dusted the ground as Ariel Bennett knelt before her daughter at a deserted bus stop. Her breath formed small clouds in the cold air. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, but her smile remained warm as she adjusted Lonnie's worn coat. Wait here, baby girl, I'll be right back, Ariel whispered, pressing her lips to Lonnie's forehead. Her hands trembled as she tucked a small backpack beside her daughter. How long, Mama? Lonnie asked, clutching her teddy bear tighter. Just a little while. Remember our song? Ariel hummed the first notes of their lullaby, and Lonnie joined in. That's my brave girl. If you get scared, just sing our song. Ariel stood, her eyes glistening. I love you more than all the stars, Lanny. Love you more than all the oceans, Mama, Lonnie replied, their familiar exchange bringing a sad smile to Ariel's face. With one last look, Ariel walked away, her shoulders hunched against the cold. She never returned. In the present, Marcus Bennett sat in his cluttered office, surrounded by case files. The private investigator rubbed his tired eyes as he connected the dots on Richard Dalton's unusual request. The name Ariel Bennett had stopped him cold. His half-sister missing for 6 months. Marcus pulled up the police report he'd obtained through contacts. The photo showed a woman with familiar eyes, eyes that haunted him with guilt. They'd lost touch years ago after their father's death revealed long-kept secrets. His phone rang. Richard Dalton. What have you found? Richard's voice was tense. Sir, this is complicated, Marcus replied. The child's mother is named Ariel Bennett. She was reported missing 6 months ago, last seen at a bus stop near Westfield Avenue. Silence hung heavy on the line. Sir? Marcus prompted. It can't be the same Ariel, Richard finally said, his voice strained. My Ariel, the one I knew, she was an art student. Talented. We were together in college. Marcus closed his eyes. Did she have a small crescent-shaped birthmark behind her right ear? The sharp intake of breath was answer enough. Mr. Dalton, there's something else you should know, Marcus continued. Ariel Bennett is my half-sister. We share a father. I've been looking for her too. Back at the penthouse, Richard hung up the phone. His hands shook as he set it down on his desk. Elena stood in the doorway, watching his face drain of color. Senor, what is wrong? She asked quietly. Richard looked up, his eyes haunted. It's her. Lonnie's mother is Ariel. My Ariel. Elena stepped into the room. You knew her mother? I more than knew her. Richard's voice cracked. I loved her, and then I left her when she told me she was pregnant. I told her I wasn't ready for a family, that it would ruin everything I'd worked for. Elena's gaze hardened. The child, she is yours? Richard stared out the window, unable to meet Elena's eyes. I don't know, but if Ariel is really missing, then that little girl has no one, Elena finished, except perhaps her father. Just then, the elevator doors opened and Marcus Bennett stepped into Richard's penthouse. His face was grim as he clutched a manila folder. Elena ushered him into Richard's study, where Richard sat stiffly behind his desk. I have the full report, Marcus said, placing the folder on the desk. There's no easy way to say this, Mr. Dalton. All evidence suggests that Ariel Bennett is Lainey's mother, and she's been missing for 6 months now. Richard reached for the folder with unsteady hands. You're certain? Yes, the police have been searching, but… Marcus trailed off. There's more you need to see. Richard opened the folder and froze. On top was a photograph of Ariel, her smile tired but genuine, holding a tiny Lonnie in her arms. The little girl couldn't have been more than 3 years old. Richard's throat tightened. When was this taken? He whispered. About 3 years ago, Marcus answered. According to neighbors, Ariel struggled to make ends meet. She worked multiple jobs, mostly as an art teacher at community centers. Richard stared at the photo, his finger tracing Ariel's face. She never told me she was pregnant. I never knew. The timing matches, Mr. Dalton, Marcus said quietly. If your relationship with my sister ended when you say it did. Richard looked up sharply. Are you suggesting that Lonnie might be your daughter? Yes, I am. When Marcus left, Richard locked his study door. He sank to the floor, the photograph clutched in his hands, and something inside him finally broke. Tears came for the first time in decades. For Ariel, for the years lost, for the little girl sleeping down the hall who hummed her mother's lullaby. Elena found him an hour later, composed but with reddened eyes. I'll arrange for a DNA test, Richard said, his voice hollow, discreetly. And what will you tell Lonnie? Elena asked. Nothing. Not until I'm sure. Richard straightened his tie. This is just protocol, Elena. Don't read too much into it. Elena's eyes narrowed. That child deserves to know something, Signor. She asks about her mother every day. Not yet, Richard insisted. I need to be certain first. That evening, as Richard reviewed documents in his study, the door creaked open. Lonnie stood there in her pajamas, clutching her teddy bear. Mr. Richard, she said, her voice small, can I ask you something? Richard set down his pen. What is it, Lonnie? She patted across the carpet and looked up at him with eyes that reminded him painfully of Ariel. Did you know my mommy? The question knocked the air from his lungs. Richard stared at her, wondering how she'd guessed. Why do you ask that? You got sad when I sang her song, Lonnie said simply, and you look at me funny sometimes. Richard swallowed hard. Yes, he admitted. I knew your mother, a long time ago. Lonnie nodded as if confirming something to herself. Then she held out her teddy bear. This is Mr. Beans. He helps me when I'm sad. She placed the worn toy on Richard's desk. He can keep you company tonight. Richard stared at the shabby bear, overwhelmed by the simple gesture of kindness. Thank you, he whispered, his voice cracking. You're welcome, Lonnie said. She hesitated, then added, Mommy said my daddy was a very important man who was too busy for us. Are you very important, Mr. Richard? Richard couldn't speak, he just nodded. That's what I thought, Lonnie said, and slipped back out the door, leaving Richard alone with her teddy bear and the weight of everything he'd lost. By the time he arrived, Richard's penthouse was filled with the quiet murmur of business conversations. A dozen executives in expensive suits mingled around platters of gourmet food, discussing quarterly projections and market expansions. Richard moved between groups with practiced ease, though his smile never reached his eyes. Marcus Bennett stood awkwardly by the elevator, clutching a sealed envelope. His tie was slightly crooked, and he kept checking his watch. Elena approached him first. Mr. Bennett, he's been avoiding you all morning, she whispered. This brunch was scheduled last minute. Marcus nodded. I understand. But he asked for these results urgently. Across the room, Richard caught sight of Marcus and his shoulders tensed visibly. He excused himself from a conversation and approached with measured steps. Marcus, he said coolly, I wasn't expecting you until this afternoon. You said to come as soon as I had the results, Marcus replied, his voice low. And I do. Richard glanced around at his guests. We can discuss this later. No, Marcus interrupted. You need to see this now. Richard's jaw tightened, but he nodded toward his study. Once inside, he closed the door and turned to Marcus. Well? He asked. Marcus handed him the envelope. The lab rushed it as you requested. Richard stared at the sealed envelope for a long moment. When he finally took it, his hands weren't steady. He tore it open and unfolded the paper inside, his eyes scanning the clinical language until they landed on the conclusion. Probability of paternity 99.9%, he read aloud, his voice barely audible. The paper trembled in his hands, Richard sank into his chair, the weight of confirmation pressing down on him. "She's mine," he whispered. "Lonnie is my daughter." Marcus stood silently, watching as Richard covered his face with his hands. When Richard looked up again, tears streaked his cheeks. "I never knew," Richard said. "If I had known Ariel was pregnant." "Would it have changed anything?" Marcus asked, not unkindly. Before Richard could answer, the door opened. Elena stepped in, stopping short when she saw Richard's tear-stained face. "Signor?" she asked, concern etching her features. Richard wiped his face quickly, but it was too late. Elena had already seen what no one else had witnessed in all her years of service: Richard Dalton crying. "The test," Richard said, holding up the paper. "She's mine, Elena. Lonnie is my daughter." Elena crossed herself. "Dios mío. You must tell her, Signor. That child deserves to know her father." Richard shook his head. I can't." "Why not?" Elena demanded. "She has been waiting for you her whole life." "Look at me, Elena," Richard said bitterly. "I'm not father material. I abandoned her mother. I've spent my life caring about nothing but money and power. Lonnie deserves someone better, someone who didn't leave Ariel alone and pregnant." "That was the past," Elena insisted. "The man I see now is changing." "It's too late," Richard said, turning away. "I can't undo what I did." Just then, a small voice called from the hallway. "Mr. Richard? Elena? Where is everybody?" The three adults froze as Lonnie's footsteps approached the study door. In the meantime, Elena decided that Lonnie needed to see more of the world beyond Richard's glass-walled penthouse. She bundled the little girl in a warm coat and colorful mittens, and together they explored the city parks, museums with children's sections, and even a small puppet show at the library. "Look, Elena, that building looks like Mr. Richard's." Lonnie pointed at a tall skyscraper as they walked through the snowy downtown area. Elena smiled and squeezed the child's hand. "Yes, Nina, he has many buildings like that." After their afternoon adventure, they sat on a bench sharing hot chocolate. Lonnie's face grew serious as she sipped from her cup, leaving a small chocolate mustache above her lip. "Does Mr. Richard like my drawings?" she asked suddenly, her voice small but hopeful. "I made him 3 more yesterday." Elena gently wiped the chocolate from Lonnie's face with a napkin. "He keeps every single one, sweetheart. I've seen him looking at them when he thinks nobody's watching." "But he doesn't smile much," Lonnie observed. "He's learning to smile again, sweetheart." "That's a big deal," Elena said, brushing a snowflake from Lonnie's hair. "Some grown-ups forget how. You're helping him remember." While Elena and Laney explored the city, Richard stood in the doorway of apartment 4C in a rundown building across town. The landlord had let him in reluctantly, explaining that the tenant, Ariel Bennett, had disappeared months ago, leaving everything behind. "Been meaning to clear it out," the man had grumbled. "But paperwork, you know." Now alone, Richard stepped inside. The small studio apartment was mostly bare: a mattress on the floor, a rickety table, a single chair. The walls were bare except for a few of what were clearly Lonnie's early drawings taped up at child height. In the corner, he found a cardboard box labeled "Keep" in Ariel's flowing handwriting. His throat tightened as he knelt beside it. Inside were a few art supplies, some paperback novels, and an envelope containing photographs. With trembling fingers, Richard pulled out the top photo. It showed Ariel, her face thinner than he remembered but still beautiful, holding a baby wrapped in a yellow blanket. Lonnie, his daughter. He turned the photo over and found a note taped to the back in Ariel's handwriting. "Her name is Lonnie. She loves stories and stars." Richard pressed the photo to his chest and closed his eyes. The simplicity of those words crushed him. All these years, while he'd been building empires and closing deals, Ariel had been raising their daughter alone, telling her stories and showing her stars. That evening, Richard returned to the penthouse later than usual. Elena was in the kitchen preparing tomorrow's meals. "She's asleep," Elena said quietly. "She tried to wait up for you." Richard nodded and walked down the hallway to Laney's room, the guest room they'd hastily converted with a few toys and colorful blankets. He stood in the doorway, watching the gentle rise and fall of her small chest as she slept, clutching a new stuffed animal Elena had bought her. Slowly, he entered the room and knelt beside her bed. Her face was peaceful in sleep, her long eyelashes resting against her cheeks. She looked so much like Ariel it made his heart ache. "I'm sorry, baby girl," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm so late." At dusk, Richard sat at his desk, pen hovering over the stack of legal documents. The guardianship paperwork for Lonnie lay before him, each page requiring his signature. Marcus stood across from him, arms folded. "This is just for protection," Richard said firmly, not looking up as he signed his name with practiced precision. "Until we figure out a more permanent solution." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "A more permanent solution, Richard? She's your daughter. The DNA test confirmed it." "I know what the test says," Richard snapped, his pen pressing harder into the paper. "But this arrangement is temporary. She deserves better than me." "Have you told her yet?" Marcus asked, his voice softening. Richard's hand stilled. "No." "When will you?" "When the time is right," Richard muttered, sliding the completed paperwork across the desk. "For now, this gives her stability. That's what matters." Later, as the sun began its descent, Richard surprised everyone by canceling his evening meetings. He asked Elena to help Lonnie into a warm coat and told his driver to take them to Riverside Gardens, a private botanical sanctuary he owned but rarely visited. The gardens were empty except for them. Autumn flowers still bloomed in carefully tended beds, and lanterns along the stone paths flickered to life as darkness fell. Richard walked slowly, hands in his pockets, while Lanny skipped ahead, marveling at everything. "Why don't people come here?" she asked, touching a vibrant orange flower. "It's pretty." "I don't usually let them," Richard answered honestly. "This place was special to someone I knew once." Lonnie looked up at him with curious eyes. "Did you have a daughter before? Like me?" The question caught Richard off guard. His breath caught in his throat. "Maybe," he managed to say, struggling with each word. Lonnie nodded solemnly, as if his answer made perfect sense. She reached for his hand, her small fingers wrapping around his. "If you did, I hope she loved you." Richard's eyes burned with unshed tears. He squeezed her hand gently, unable to speak. As they rounded a bend in the path, a figure stepped out from behind a large oak tree. Marcus stood there, his face set in determination. "Richard," he called out, "we need to talk." Richard stiffened. "Not now." "Yes, now." Marcus approached them, nodding politely to Lonnie. "Sweetheart, would you mind looking at those pretty flowers over there for a minute? I need to speak with Mr. Richard." Once Lanny was out of earshot, Marcus turned to Richard. "You're being a coward." "Excuse me?" Richard's voice was dangerously quiet. "You heard me. That little girl deserves to know who her father is." Marcus pulled out his phone. "Ariel left you a message 2 days before she died. I found it on her old voicemail service." Before Richard could object, Marcus pressed play. Ariel's voice, thin but determined, filled the space between them. "Richard, it's me. I know it's been years. But I need you to know about Lonnie. She's your daughter. I'm not well and I'm scared. Please, if you get this, try again. Even if it's hard, she needs you. We both did." The message ended. Richard stood frozen, his face pale in the fading light. "You owe her the truth," Marcus said quietly. "Both of them." All of a sudden, Richard found himself sitting alone in his home office, hands trembling as he scrolled through his archived voicemails. Marcus's confrontation in the garden had shaken him deeply. There had to be more, some message he'd missed or ignored. His finger hovered over the screen as he accessed a folder labeled Saved 2018. There it was, a number he'd once known by heart, Ariel's number. With a deep breath, he pressed play. "Richard." Her voice was softer than in Marcus's recording, more hesitant. "I know you probably don't want to hear from me. It's been years now. But there's someone you should know about. A pause, filled with the sound of her breathing. Her name is Lanny. She's your daughter, Richard. She's beautiful and smart and… Her voice broke. She deserves a dad, even if he's late. Richard closed his eyes, tears streaming down his face. The message continued, but he could barely hear it through the pounding of his heart. She had reached out, and he had never known. That evening at dinner, the penthouse was unusually quiet. Elena had prepared Lonnie's favorite, spaghetti with extra cheese, but Richard barely touched his food. He kept stealing glances at Lonnie, seeing Ariel's eyes looking back at him. "Mr. Richard?" Lonnie's small voice cut through his thoughts. "Yes," he answered, trying to sound normal. Lonnie put down her fork and looked directly at him. "Are you my daddy?" The question hung in the air like a suspended note. Elena froze by the kitchen doorway, dish towel in hand. Richard felt his chest tighten. "What makes you ask that?" he managed, his voice strained. "You look at me funny, like you're scared." Lonnie tilted her head. "And you knew my mommy. And sometimes when I sing her song, you get tears." Richard swallowed hard. "Lonnie, The word stuck in his throat. Fear gripped him. Fear of failing her, of not being enough. "No, sweetie. I just knew your mother a long time ago." The lie felt bitter on his tongue. Lonnie's face fell slightly, but she nodded and went back to her spaghetti. "I think I'm done," Richard said abruptly, placing his napkin beside his plate. "Excuse me." He retreated to his bedroom, closing the door behind him. He sank onto the edge of his bed, head in his hands. What kind of man was he? Too afraid to claim his own child? That night, sleep came fitfully. In his dreams, he saw Ariel as she had been years ago, vibrant and full of life. She stood in a garden of light, Lonnie's small hand in hers. "You don't have much time," Dream Ariel said, her voice echoing. "She needs you to be brave." "I don't know how," Richard whispered. Ariel smiled sadly. She reached out, taking Richard's hand and placing Laney's hand in it. "Just love her. The rest will follow." Richard woke with a gasp, his pillow wet with tears. The first light of dawn filtered through his curtains. He knew what he had to do. The truth couldn't wait any longer. Days turned into weeks, and something remarkable began to happen in the Dalton penthouse. Richard, who once spent his evenings poring over spreadsheets and market reports, now sat cross-legged on the living room floor with Lonnie, building towers from colorful blocks and reading bedtime stories. "Again!" Lonnie would plead after he finished reading The Paper Bag Princess for the third time, and Richard, to his own surprise, would smile and turn back to the first page. "Just one more time," he'd say, though they both knew it was never just once. Elena watched this transformation with quiet satisfaction. She noticed how Richard's phone calls grew shorter, how he'd check his watch during business meetings, eager to return home. Once, she overheard him decline a major investment opportunity because it conflicted with Lonnie's school art show. "I have a prior commitment," he'd said firmly into the phone. Later that afternoon, he stood proudly in the elementary school hallway, admiring Lonnie's crayon drawing of what appeared to be a tall man holding a little girl's hand. "That's you and me," Lonnie explained, pointing to the figures. "Elena says you're my guardian angel." Richard's throat tightened. Guardian, not father. The word stung. One evening, as Richard tucked Lonnie into bed, she asked about her mother. "Did she like stars like I do?" Lonnie wondered, pointing to the glow-in-the-dark constellation stickers Richard had helped her place on her ceiling. "She loved them," Richard answered softly. "She used to say that even when people are apart, they're still under the same stars." "I miss her," Lonnie whispered. "I know, baby girl," Richard said, using the endearment he'd heard in Ariel's voicemail. "I miss her too." Marcus visited the penthouse regularly, bringing updates on the legal guardianship process. After one such meeting, he cornered Richard in the kitchen. "You need to tell her," Marcus insisted, keeping his voice low. "She deserves to know who you really are." "I'm working up to it," Richard defended. "Secrets always surface, Richard," Marcus warned. And the longer you wait, the more it will hurt when she finds out. She's a smart kid." Richard nodded, knowing Marcus was right. "This weekend," he promised. "I'll tell her this weekend." But fate had other plans. The following afternoon, while Richard stepped out to take an urgent call, Lonnie wandered into his home office looking for drawing paper. On his usually immaculate desk sat an open manila folder. Curious, Lonnie peered inside. There was a photograph of her mother, younger, smiling broadly with her arms around a man Lonnie recognized as Richard. Below it lay an official-looking document with the words DNA paternity test in bold letters. Next to it were court papers with both her name and Richard's. Lonnie's eyes widened as understanding dawned. She traced her finger over the photograph, over the faces of her mother, and the man she now knew was her father. At that moment, Lonnie's small hands trembled as she clutched the photograph. She carefully put it back in the folder and tiptoed out of the office, her heart beating fast like a little bird's. She found Elena in the kitchen, humming softly while chopping vegetables for dinner. "Elena?" Lonnie's voice was tiny. Elena turned, her warm eyes noticing immediately that something was wrong. "What is it, mi corazon?" "Is Richard my real dad?" The question hung in the air between them. Elena's knife clattered onto the cutting board. She wiped her hands on her apron and knelt down to Lonnie's level. Her face showed a battle between truth and loyalty. "Ay, niña," she sighed, taking Lonnie's hands in hers. "What made you ask such a thing?" "I saw a picture, and papers with our names," Lonnie explained, her eyes wide and serious. "It said, DNA test." Elena closed her eyes briefly. She had warned Richard about waiting too long. "Lonnie, sweetheart, this is something you should talk to Richard about." "So it's true?" Lonnie pressed. Elena stroked Lonnie's cheek gently. "I cannot lie to you, pequeña, but some truths belong to others to tell. Talk to him tonight. He cares for you very much." Lonnie nodded solemnly, a wisdom beyond her years settling in her expression. That night after dinner, Lonnie didn't ask for a bedtime story. Instead, she took her worn teddy bear and padded quietly to Richard's study. She pushed open the heavy door and found him at his desk, glasses perched on his nose, reviewing documents. Richard looked up, surprised. "Lonnie, shouldn't you be getting ready for bed?" Instead of answering, Lonnie climbed into the leather chair across from him, clutching her teddy bear tightly. The bear, her constant companion since before she could remember, seemed to give her courage. "Am I your daughter?" she asked, her voice clear and direct. Richard's face paled. The pen in his hand dropped to the desk. For a moment that stretched like forever. He said nothing, just looked at her. Really looked at her. He saw Ariel's eyes, her determined chin, but also something of himself in the way she held her shoulders. Slowly, he rose from his chair and came around the desk. He knelt beside her, bringing himself to her eye level. "Yes," he said, his voice catching. "Yes, Lonnie, you are my daughter, and I'm the luckiest man in the world." Tears filled Lonnie's eyes. "I knew it," she whispered. She reached out her small arms and wrapped them around his neck. Richard pulled her close, his own tears falling freely now. They stayed like that, holding each other, the walls Richard had built around his heart crumbling completely. When they finally pulled apart, Lonnie looked up at him with wet eyelashes. "Then why did you leave Mommy?" she asked. The question hit Richard like a physical blow. A silence so heavy it filled the room settled between them. "Because I was a fool," he finally answered, his voice raw with regret. "I was young and scared and made the worst mistake of my life. But I won't leave you, Lonnie. Not ever again. I promise." Lonnie studied his face carefully as if memorizing it. Then she nodded once, accepting his answer with the simple faith only children possess. "Can I call you Daddy now?" she asked. Richard's heart swelled until he thought it might burst. Nothing would make me happier. Eventually, Richard Dalton began introducing Lonnie Carter as his niece to public acquaintances and business partners. They were at a charity gala, and Richard kept his hand protectively on Lonnie's shoulder as he spoke to a group of investors. "My niece," he said smoothly when asked about the little girl in the sparkly purple dress. "She's staying with me for a while." Lonnie looked up at him, confusion flickering across her face. Just that morning, he had called her his daughter as they made pancakes together. Now the word niece hung in the air between them like an invisible wall. Later that evening, as Elena helped Lonnie get ready for bed, Richard paced in his study. "It's for her protection," he muttered when Elena entered. "The press would have a field day. Heartless businessman abandons pregnant girlfriend, discovers orphaned daughter years later." Can you imagine the headlines? Elena's normally gentle eyes hardened. "So you protect yourself and call it protecting her?" "That's not fair," Richard protested. "No, senor, what's not fair is teaching that child to hide who she is." Elena folded her arms across her chest. "You can't claim the love without owning the mistake." Richard turned away, unable to meet her steady gaze. The next morning, Lanny sat coloring at the kitchen counter while Richard took a business call in the next room. His voice carried, unaware of her presence. "No, it's temporary," he was saying. "The girl is just, well, it's complicated. Let's call it my good deed for the year." A laugh from the other end of the line. "A charity case, I suppose you could say that?" Lonnie's crayon broke in her hand, leaving a jagged red line across her drawing. Her bottom lip trembled as she slipped off the stool and ran to her room. That afternoon, Marcus Bennett arrived to drop off some final paperwork. He found Lonnie sitting alone on the balcony, her small legs dangling between the railings. "Hey there, sunshine," he said, sitting beside her. "Why the long face?" Lonnie looked up, her eyes red-rimmed. "Am I a charity case?" Marcus stiffened. "Who told you that?" "I heard Richard say it on the phone." Lonnie's voice was small. "What does it mean?" Marcus took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "It means someone doesn't understand what's really happening here." He turned to face her fully. "Listen to me, Lonnie. You're not a case. You're the reason people should believe in second chances." Lonnie considered this, her brow furrowed in thought. Inside, Elena was confronting Richard again. "She heard you, senor. On the phone." Richard's face fell. "Heard what?" "That she is your charity case." Elena's voice dripped with disappointment. "That little girl who calls you daddy when you tuck her in at night believes you are ashamed of her." Richard sank into a chair, the weight of his cowardice crushing him. Through the window, he could see Marcus and Laney talking on the balcony, his daughter and the brother of the woman he had abandoned. "What have I done?" he whispered. On that very night, the grand ballroom of the Westfield Hotel glittered with crystal chandeliers and the jewelry of New York's elite. Richard Dalton stood tall in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, one hand holding a champagne flute, the other resting lightly on Lonnie's shoulder. She wore a new dress for the occasion, sky blue with tiny silver stars that matched the clips in her hair. "Mr. Dalton," called a woman with a recorder in hand, her press badge catching the light. "Sarah Collins, City Chronicle. Is this the little girl I've heard about? Your adopted daughter?" Richard's fingers tightened slightly on Lonnie's shoulder. The room seemed to quiet around them as several nearby guests turned to listen. "No," he said, his voice smooth but distant. "She's someone I'm looking after." Lonnie looked up at him, her small face frozen in a half-smile that didn't reach her eyes. She had practiced saying, "My daddy is Richard Dalton," in front of the bathroom mirror that morning. Now those words felt like stones in her throat. "For how long?" the reporter pressed. "That's still being determined," Richard answered, already guiding Lonnie away. "If you'll excuse us." For the rest of the evening, Lonnie stood quietly beside him, nodding when spoken to, but the light had gone out of her eyes. The ride home was silent, her small hand no longer reaching for his as it usually did. At the penthouse, Elena waited up for them. "How was the party, Nina?" she asked, helping Lonnie out of her coat. Lonnie just shrugged and walked to her room without a word. "What happened?" Elena asked Richard, her eyes narrowing with concern. "A reporter asked questions," he said, loosening his tie. "It was nothing." But it wasn't nothing. Over the next few days, Lonnie grew quiet. She stopped humming Ariel's lullaby while she colored. Her drawings, once bright and filled with smiling figures, became sparse, with large, empty spaces. When Richard tried to read her a bedtime story, she turned away, clutching her teddy bear to her chest. "She's hurting," Elena told him one morning as Lonnie picked at her breakfast. "Children understand more than we think." Richard nodded, guilt weighing heavily on his shoulders, but he still didn't know how to fix what he'd broken. 2 days later, Marcus Bennett strode into Richard's office without an appointment, brushing past the protesting secretary. Several executives from the morning meeting were still present, but Marcus didn't seem to care. "We need to talk," he said, his voice carrying across the room. "About Ariel." Richard stood quickly. "This isn't the time." "When is the time?" Marcus demanded. "When Lonnie stops believing in you altogether." The executives exchanged glances, suddenly very interested in their coffee cups. "Gentlemen, if you'll excuse us," Richard said tightly. Once the room cleared, he turned to Marcus. "What do you want?" "Ariel left a letter," Marcus said. "She wrote it to you but never sent it. I think it's still with Lonnie's belongings, the things that were recovered from the apartment." Richard stared at him. "A letter? Why didn't you tell me before?" "Because I wanted to see if you'd do the right thing without it," Marcus answered. "But now I see that little girl is disappearing into herself because you're too afraid to claim her publicly." Richard sank into his chair, the weight of his cowardice crushing him once again. "Find that letter," Marcus said, his voice softening slightly. "Maybe Ariel's words can give you the courage yours can't find." Back then, the university campus had been alive with possibilities. Maple trees lined the walkways, their leaves a brilliant orange and red in the autumn light. Richard Dalton sat on a bench outside the economics building, textbook stacked beside him, his mind focused on his future. Wall Street, wealth, success. That was until Ariel Bennett appeared, her paint-splattered jeans and wild curly hair a stark contrast to his pressed shirt and careful appearance. "You look too serious," she'd said, sitting down without invitation. "Like you've forgotten how to smile." He'd been annoyed at first, then intrigued. She saw the world differently, through color and emotion rather than numbers and strategy. Somehow they fit together. For 2 years they were inseparable. She painted while he studied. He calculated while she dreamed. They balanced each other. Until that cold November afternoon in his apartment. "I'm pregnant," Ariel said, her voice barely above a whisper. She stood by the window, arms wrapped around herself, looking more vulnerable than he'd ever seen her. Richard froze, the economics paper in his hand suddenly meaningless. That's impossible. We were careful." "Nothing's impossible," she said with a small, nervous smile. "That's what you like about me, remember?" But Richard couldn't smile back. His father's voice echoed in his head. "Distractions cost fortunes, boy. Focus is how you build empires." "I can't do this," he said, standing up. "Not now. I have the internship at Morgan Stanley, my father's connections, my whole future is laid out." "And a baby isn't part of that future?" Ariel's eyes filled with tears. "Be realistic, Ariel. We're 22, I can't be a father, I can't—" "You mean you won't," she corrected him, her voice breaking. They argued for hours. She begged him to reconsider. He offered money for options. She called him a coward. He said she was being naive. In the end, Richard walked out of his own apartment, unable to face the choice before him. When he returned the next morning, Ariel was gone. He never looked for her, never called. Convinced himself it was for the best. He buried himself in work, in success, in wealth. And for 30 years, he never allowed himself to look back. Until now. Richard sat in his study, turning Lonnie's teddy bear over in his hands. The worn fabric was soft, patched in several places. One eye was slightly loose. This bear had been loved, truly loved, for all of Lonnie's short life. Marcus's words echoed in his mind. "Find that letter." Richard examined the bear more closely, running his fingers along the seams. Near the back, he felt something unusual, a slight crinkle. He turned the bear over and noticed a small section where the stitching was different, newer than the rest. With careful fingers, he opened the tiny hidden seam and reached inside. His fingers touched paper. Slowly, he pulled out a tightly folded, slightly stained envelope. His name was written on the front in Ariel's distinctive handwriting. Richard stared at it, his heart pounding so loudly he was sure Elena could hear it from the kitchen. His hands trembled. What final words had Ariel written to him? What condemnation? What truths that he'd been running from for decades, and he couldn't open it. Not yet. He was terrified of what it might say. Richard placed the letter on his desk, still folded, and buried his face in his hands. At midnight, the penthouse was silent except for the soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Richard sat alone in his study, the lamp casting long shadows across his face. The letter from Ariel lay on his desk, still folded, like a time bomb waiting to explode his carefully constructed life. He reached for his glass of whiskey, then pulled his hand back. Number. He needed to face this with a clear head. With trembling fingers, Richard picked up the envelope. The paper felt thin, fragile from years of being hidden away. He broke the seal carefully and unfolded the letter inside. Ariel's handwriting, once so familiar to him, flowed across the page. "Dear Richard," it began, "I've written this letter 100 times in my head. I don't know if you'll ever read it, but I need to believe you might." Richard's throat tightened as he continued reading. "Our daughter's name is Lonnie. She has your eyes and your stubborn chin. She's smart like you, figures things out so quickly it sometimes scares me. But she has my heart, thank goodness." A tear splashed onto the paper. Richard wiped his eyes and read on. "I've been sick for months now. The doctors don't give me much time. I'm trying to find you. But you've built such high walls around yourself. If anything happens to me, please find her. I know you won't believe it at first, but she's yours. And she's everything we could have been." The words blurred before his eyes. Richard pressed his fist against his mouth to stop himself from making a sound. "I don't hate you anymore, Richard. I'm too tired for hate. But I do hope you've learned that success means nothing if you're too afraid to love. Lonnie deserves a father, even if he's late." The letter ended simply, "She knows your song. Ariel." Richard set the letter down and buried his face in his hands. His shoulders shook with silent sobs. 30 years of running. 30 years of building wealth and power, while the only things that mattered, Ariel and their daughter, struggled alone. He stood up suddenly, needing to see Lonnie. He walked down the hallway to her bedroom, opening the door quietly. The nightlight cast a soft glow over her sleeping form. Her small chest rose and fell with each breath. Her hair spread across the pillow. Richard's daughter, his child. He knelt beside her bed, careful not to wake her. "I'm so sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry I wasn't there. But I promise you, Lonnie, I will never fail you again." He stayed there for a long time, watching her sleep, making silent vows to both Lonnie and Ariel's memory. When morning came, Richard found Elena in the kitchen preparing breakfast. His eyes were red-rimmed but clear, his posture straighter than it had been in weeks. "I'm going to tell the world who Lonnie really is," he said without preamble. "My daughter. Not my niece, not someone I'm looking after. My daughter." Elena paused, spatula in hand. A slow smile spread across her face, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her in weeks. "It's about time," she said simply, turning back to the stove. But Richard didn't miss the glint of tears in her eyes or the pride in her voice. Soon after Richard's decision, the penthouse buzzed with activity. A professional camera crew set up in his living room, where the city skyline provided a dramatic backdrop. Richard sat stiffly in his chair, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "Are you sure about this?" Elena asked quietly, straightening his tie. Richard nodded. "For the first time in my life, I'm completely sure." When the cameras rolled, Richard looked directly into the lens. His voice, usually commanding in boardrooms, now carried a trembling vulnerability. My name is Richard Dalton. Many of you know me as a businessman, but today I'm speaking to you as a father." He paused, swallowing hard. 6 weeks ago, I found a little girl at a bus stop. Her name is Lonnie Carter, and she is my daughter. He spoke plainly about his past mistakes, about abandoning Ariel when she needed him most, about discovering Lonnie was his child. "I cannot undo my failures," he said, "but I can promise to be the father she deserves from this day forward." Within hours of posting, the video spread like wildfire. Dalton's daughter trended nationwide. Messages flooded in, many supportive, calling it a story of redemption. But others were vicious, labeling him an opportunist trying to whitewash his cutthroat business reputation. By evening, every news outlet had picked up the story. Reporters camped outside the building. Old college acquaintances sold stories about Richard and Ariel's relationship. Business rivals questioned the timing, suggesting it was a publicity stunt to humanize his corporate image. Marcus stormed into the penthouse the next day, waving his phone with headlines blazing across the screen. "What is this?" he demanded, finding Richard in his study. "You're trending everywhere. Billionaire's secret child, Dalton's daughter, the heartwarming discovery. Is this why you did it?" Richard stood up. "I did it because it was time to tell the truth." "The truth?" Marcus laughed bitterly. "The truth is you abandoned my sister when she needed you. The truth is Lonnie grew up without a father, and now you're using her story to clean up your image." "That's not fair," Richard shot back. "I'm trying to do right by her. Right by her or right by Richard Dalton's reputation?" Marcus stepped closer. "You couldn't even say she was your daughter at that charity event. Now suddenly you're Father of the Year with a viral video?" Their voices grew louder, echoing through the penthouse halls. "I made mistakes, I've admitted that," Richard shouted. "Mistakes?" Marcus roared. "My sister died alone. Lonnie isn't your redemption story." Neither man noticed the small figure in the hallway. Lonnie stood frozen, her teddy bear clutched tightly against her chest, eyes wide with confusion and fear. Elena spotted her from the kitchen and hurried over, but Lonnie had already backed away. The little girl turned and ran to her room, grabbing her small backpack. She stuffed in her crayons, a drawing of Richard and her mother's photo. While the argument raged on and Elena tried to intervene, Lainey slipped out through the service entrance she'd seen Elena use. The elevator attendant was distracted by a delivery, never noticing the small child who pressed the lobby button. Minutes later, Lonnie Carter disappeared into the bustling city streets, her teddy bear tucked under her arm, her heart racing with confusion and hurt. The only father she'd ever known was fighting because of her. Maybe she thought everything would be better if she just went away. Right then and there, the arguing voices fell silent as Elena burst into Richard's study, her face drained of color. "Lainey's gone," she gasped. "Her backpack is missing and so is her teddy bear." Richard's heart stopped. "What do you mean gone?" "I saw her in the hallway during your argument," Elena explained, wringing her hands. "When I went to check on her, her room was empty." The two men exchanged horrified glances, their anger instantly forgotten. "The security cameras," Richard said, rushing to his computer. They watched in stunned silence as the footage showed Lonnie slipping into the service elevator alone. "She heard us," Marcus whispered, his voice breaking. "She heard everything." Richard grabbed his coat. "I'll take the car and search the neighborhood." "I'll check the parks and shelters," Marcus offered, already dialing on his phone. Elena nodded firmly. "I know people at the churches and community centers. I'll make calls." Within minutes, they had mobilized a search party. Richard's driver scoured the streets while Richard himself walked the sidewalks, calling Lonnie's name into the darkness. His breath formed clouds in the cold night air as panic clawed at his chest. "Please," he whispered to no one in particular. "Please let her be safe." Across town, Lonnie huddled at the same bus stop where Richard had found her weeks ago. The bench was cold against her small body as she curled into the corner, clutching her drawing. She had walked for what felt like forever, following street signs and landmarks until she recognized the place where she had last seen her mother. "Mommy always said to wait if I got lost," she whispered to her teddy bear, her voice trembling. so I'll wait right here." Hours passed. The city grew quieter as midnight came and went. Lonnie's eyelids grew heavy, but she fought sleep. What if her mommy came back? What if Richard came looking? Her little heart was torn between hope and hurt. As the first light of dawn approached, snow began to fall, delicate flakes that danced in the streetlights. Lonnie shivered, pulling her coat tighter around her shoulders. Her fingers had gone numb despite her mittens, but she still clutched her crayon drawing of Richard and herself, holding hands beneath a bright sun. The sound of running footsteps made her look up. There, illuminated by the pale glow of early morning, was Richard. His expensive coat was rumpled, his hair disheveled, his face etched with fear and relief. "Lonnie!" he cried, rushing toward her. She didn't move from her spot, her small face solemn. As Richard knelt before her, snow collecting on his shoulders, she asked the question that had been burning in her heart since she'd overheard the argument. "Is it true? Did you leave Mommy?" Her voice was tiny but steady. Richard's face crumpled. For a moment he looked like he might break apart. Then he took a deep breath and nodded. "Yes," he whispered, tears gathering in his eyes. "I did. I was young and scared and selfish. I made the biggest mistake of my life." He reached out, his hands trembling but didn't touch her yet. "But I'll never leave you again," he promised, his voice breaking. "Not ever, no matter what." As time went on, Richard Dalton became a visibly changed man. The corporate titan who once dominated boardrooms now politely declined high-profile speaking engagements and rescheduled meetings that conflicted with school drop-offs. Each morning, he walked hand-in-hand with Lonnie to her elementary school, her bright yellow backpack bouncing as she skipped beside him. "Have a good day, sweetheart," he'd say, kneeling to straighten her collar before she raced off to join her classmates. People noticed. Assistants who had feared his temper now witnessed him pausing meetings to take calls from Lonnie's teacher. Business partners who had known only his ruthless negotiating tactics now saw him checking his watch, apologizing as he left early for parent-teacher conferences. "I never thought I'd see the day," whispered one longtime colleague to another, as Richard excused himself from a major investment discussion to attend Lonnie's art show. Twice a week, Richard sat in a comfortable chair across from Dr. Marion Wells, a family therapist with kind eyes and a no-nonsense approach. In their 6th session, Richard finally broke down. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Every time I look at her, I see Ariel. I see my failure." Dr. Wells leaned forward. "You're punishing yourself by remembering who you were, not celebrating who you're becoming." Richard stared at his hands. "I abandoned them both. How can I possibly deserve her now?" "You don't earn forgiveness by suffering, Richard," Dr. Wells said firmly. "You earn it by showing up. Every morning, every bedtime story, every scraped knee and homework assignment. That's what matters to Lonnie." Across town, Marcus Bennett sat on a park bench beside Elena, watching Lonnie chase bubbles across the grass. Her laughter echoed through the air as Richard joined in, his expensive shoes forgotten in the damp grass. "I've never seen him like this," Marcus admitted, his voice softer than Elena had ever heard it. "When we were investigating Ariel's disappearance, I imagined him as this heartless monster who abandoned my sister." Elena nodded. "And now? Now I don't doubt that he loves her," Marcus said, watching as Richard scooped Lonnie up and spun her around. "I just don't know if love is enough to make up for everything else." Elena patted his hand gently. "Love is where healing begins, not where it ends. They have a long road ahead." They watched as Laney whispered something in Richard's ear that made him throw his head back in genuine laughter, something his employees would have claimed was impossible just months ago. "He's trying," Elena added. "That counts for something, doesn't it?" Marcus nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving the pair. "Maybe it does," he conceded. "Maybe it counts for more than I thought." During the summer of 1965, Richard's father walked out of their modest suburban home without a backward glance, leaving behind only a hastily scribbled note and a 10-year-old boy who would never be the same. Richard wasn't thinking about that particular summer day as he and Marcus wandered the tree-lined paths of Westlake University, but the memory hung between them like an unspoken weight. "This is where we met," Richard said quietly, pausing beneath a sprawling oak tree. "Ariel was sketching this same tree. I was rushing to economics class and nearly knocked her supplies into the grass." Marcus nodded, his hands tucked into his jacket pockets. The campus hadn't changed much in 20 years. Still the same red brick buildings, the same wrought iron benches where students hunched over textbooks. "She always said you were the most serious person she'd ever met," Marcus replied. Richard's laugh was hollow. "I had to be." He sat down on one of the benches, his expensive suit out of place among the casual college atmosphere. "During the summer of 1965, my father walked out on us, left a note saying emotions were for weak men." His voice grew distant. "I was 10. I decided right then I'd never be weak again." Marcus sat beside him, surprised by the confession. "Ariel was the only one who ever got past that," Richard continued, staring at the tree where they'd first met. "Until Lonnie." He swallowed hard. "They have the same laugh." After a moment of silence, Marcus reached into his messenger bag and pulled out a small cardboard box. "I found these at my mother's house last week. Ariel's journals. I thought—" He hesitated. "I thought you should have them." Richard took the box with trembling hands. "Thank you." That evening, long after Lonnie had gone to bed, Richard sat in his study with the journals spread before him. His fingers traced Ariel's handwriting, each loop and curve so achingly familiar. He stopped at an entry dated 3 years ago. "Lonnie took her first steps today, 3 wobbly steps before falling into my arms. I almost called Richard. I had the phone in my hand, wondering if he'd care that his daughter just walked for the first time. Then I remembered the look in his eyes when I told him I was pregnant. I put the phone down." Richard closed the journal, tears streaming down his face. 2 weeks later, Richard sat in the 3rd row of Lonnie's elementary school auditorium for the spring talent show. Beside him, Marcus and Elena exchanged nervous glances as Lonnie's name was announced. The little girl walked onto the stage in a blue dress, her hair decorated with tiny butterfly clips. She approached the microphone, looking impossibly small. "I'm going to sing my mommy's song," she announced. She sang it to me every night. The first notes of Ariel's lullaby filled the auditorium, the same melody that had stopped Richard cold that first night at the penthouse. Lonnie's sweet, clear voice carried the familiar tune, and Richard felt something break open inside him. He didn't try to hide the tears that came. Marcus reached over and squeezed his shoulder as Richard listened to the song that had traveled from Ariel's heart to Lainey's, a bridge connecting past to future. Out of nowhere, Richard's cell phone rang while he was helping Lonnie practice her spelling words at the kitchen table. The caller ID displayed State Capitol. He frowned, excused himself, and stepped into the hallway. "Mr. Dalton, this is Marianne Wells from Governor Harrison's office." The woman's voice was crisp and professional. "The governor has been following your story with great interest." Richard's grip tightened on the phone. "Has he now?" "Indeed. Your journey has touched many hearts across the state. The governor would like to present you with this year's Transformational Impact Through Family Advocacy Award at next month's charity gala." Richard watched through the doorway as Lonnie carefully wrote out her words, her tongue poking out in concentration. Something about the award offer felt hollow, like it was missing the point of everything that had happened. "I appreciate the honor," Richard said quietly, "but I must decline." "I'm sorry." The woman sounded genuinely surprised. "This is quite prestigious, Mr. Dalton. There would be considerable media coverage which could only help your situation." "My situation doesn't need help," Richard replied firmly. "Please thank the governor, but my answer is no." After ending the call, Richard made another one to Marcus. The following afternoon, Marcus arrived at the penthouse with a stack of legal folders. Richard had cleared his schedule, and the 2 men sat across from each other in the study. "You're sure about this?" Marcus asked, spreading the incorporation papers across the desk. Richard nodded. The Ariel Bennett Foundation focused on housing security for single mothers and their children, emergency support services, and educational opportunities. It's a lot of money, Marcus noted, glancing at the initial endowment figure. It's what she deserved 20 years ago, Richard replied. Help that never came. Marcus studied Richard's face. And you want me to co-chair this? There's no one better. Richard leaned forward. You knew her heart. You've been Lainey's protector from the beginning. I need you, Marcus. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, turning a pen between his fingers. I'll do it on one condition. Name it. This can't be about your redemption, Marcus said firmly. It can't be about easing your guilt or polishing your image. It has to be about her legacy, about what Ariel would have wanted. Richard didn't hesitate. It always was. For the first time since they'd met, Marcus extended his hand across the desk. Richard took it, the handshake sealing more than just a business arrangement. Daddy? Lonnie's voice came from the doorway. She stood there clutching a crayon drawing. I made something for Mommy's foundation. Richard and Marcus exchanged a glance, then Richard beckoned her forward. Come show us, sweetheart. Lonnie placed her drawing on top of the legal papers, a colorful picture of 3 stick figures holding hands under a rainbow. She'd written in careful letters, Mommy's help for everybody. That's perfect, Marcus said softly. I think we just found our logo. Earlier that day, the penthouse buzzed with nervous energy. Lonnie sat at the kitchen table, her legs swinging beneath her chair as she carefully practiced reading from a sheet of paper. Elena stood behind her, gently guiding her through the words. My mommy isn't gone, Lonnie read slowly, her finger tracing each word. She lives in every hug, every drawing, every lullaby. Perfect, mi Angelita, Elena said, smoothing Lonnie's curls. Now let's try it once more without looking at the paper. Lonnie closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and repeated the line. When she opened her eyes, they sparkled with determination. I want to say it myself tonight. No grown-ups helping. Elena nodded. Your father will be very proud. In his bedroom, Richard adjusted his tie for the 3rd time. The foundation launch was hours away, and his hands wouldn't stop trembling. This wasn't like any business presentation he'd ever given. This was Ariel's legacy, their daughter's future. You need help with that? Elena appeared in the doorway. I've tied 1,000 ties, Richard muttered. But never with so much heart behind it, Elena replied, stepping forward to straighten it anyway. Lonnie is ready. She insists on giving her part of the speech herself. Richard's eyes widened. Is that a good idea? There will be hundreds of people there. Elena gave him a knowing look. She is stronger than you think, just like her mother. The grand ballroom of the Riverside Hotel glittered with lights and flowers. Photos of smiling mothers and children decorated the entrance, alongside the foundation's new logo. Lonnie's crayon drawing, professionally rendered but keeping its childlike charm. Richard stood near the stage, greeting donors and supporters, when Marcus approached with a tablet in hand. The tribute video is ready, Marcus said. I wanted you to see it first. Richard glanced at the screen and froze. There was Ariel, not the college girl he remembered, but a young mother. She was sitting on a park bench, laughing as toddler Lainey tried to catch falling leaves. Another showed her painting at a community center, Lonnie strapped to her back. Where did these come from? Richard whispered. People who knew her. Neighbors, fellow artists. They've been sending them since the foundation was announced. Marcus squeezed Richard's shoulder. She built a life, Richard. A beautiful one. When the time came for speeches, Richard spoke briefly about the foundation's mission. Then, with a trembling voice, he introduced Lonnie. The audience fell silent as the small girl approached the microphone, wearing a blue dress with a ribbon in her hair. She unfolded her paper, but then set it aside. My name is Lonnie Carter Dalton, she began, her voice small but clear. My mommy was Ariel Bennett. She was brave and kind and always sang to me. Richard watched, his heart swelling with pride and grief. My mommy isn't gone, Lonnie continued. She lives in every hug, every drawing, every lullaby. Then Lanny reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded paper. She walked to Richard and handed it to him. This is for you, Daddy. Richard unfolded it to find a crayon drawing of a house. Not the penthouse, but a home with a yard and trees. 3 stick figures stood holding hands. "This is you, me, and Mommy," Lonnie explained, pointing to each figure. "Because you said she's always with us." The room blurred as tears filled Richard's eyes. He knelt and pulled Lonnie into a tight embrace, no longer caring who was watching. At that moment, standing beside his daughter as the crowd applauded, Richard felt something shift inside him. The weight he'd carried for years, the shame of abandoning Ariel, the guilt of missing Lonnie's early years, didn't vanish but transformed. It was no longer a burden that crushed him, but a memory that motivated him. He looked down at Lonnie, her small hand tucked in his, and knew what he needed to do next. 3 days after the foundation launch, Richard called Elena into his study. Maps and real estate listings covered his usually pristine desk. "I'm selling the penthouse," he announced. Elena's eyebrows shot up. "The penthouse? But you've lived there for 15 years. Richard nodded, pointing to a modest 2-story home circled in red marker. "This house is 5 blocks from Lonnie's school. It has a backyard. Room for a dog, maybe." "You hate dogs," Elena reminded him. "Lonnie doesn't," Richard replied simply. He studied Elena's face. "Will you come with us? I know it's not as fancy." "Fancy was never what mattered to me," Elena interrupted, her eyes growing moist. "Family is what matters." When Richard told Lonnie about the move, her eyes grew wide. "We're leaving the Sky House?" "The penthouse," Richard corrected gently. "Yes, we're going to live in a real home, with grass and trees." "Like in my drawing?" Lonnie asked. "Exactly like your drawing." The following weekend, they visited the house together. Lonnie ran from room to room, her footsteps echoing in the empty spaces. She claimed a bedroom with a window seat overlooking a maple tree. "It's not a downgrade," Richard told Elena as they watched Lonnie exploring. "It's an upgrade in every way that matters." On moving day, Lonnie insisted on helping. Richard gave her the job of packing her own toys, but she soon wandered into his bedroom, curious about what treasures her father might be bringing to their new home. "What's this?" she asked, pulling a dusty box from the back of his closet. Richard knelt beside her as she opened it. Inside were old photographs, college days, early business ventures, and buried at the bottom, a picture he'd never seen before. Ariel, her face glowing, holding a tiny bundle that could only be newborn Lonnie. "Where did this come from?" he whispered. "Marcus gave me more pictures," Lonnie explained. "He said you should have them too." Richard's fingers trembled as he lifted the photograph. Ariel's smile seemed to speak directly to him across the years. When they arrived at their new home, Richard didn't hesitate. He took the picture of Ariel and baby Lonnie and hung it on the living room wall, not tucked away in a bedroom or study, but where everyone would see it first upon entering. "Front and center," he said, stepping back to make sure it was straight. "She's the reason we're here." Lonnie stood beside him, her small hand slipping into his. "Do you think Mommy would like our new house?" Richard looked around at the modest rooms, so different from his luxury penthouse, yet somehow more like home than anywhere he'd lived in decades. "Yes," he said softly. "I think she would love it." At sunrise, Richard stood in the kitchen of their new home, squinting at the toaster. The appliance seemed unnecessarily complicated for something that just heated bread. He pressed a button, hoping it was the right one. Sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows, painting golden rectangles on the floor. This kitchen was half the size of his penthouses, but somehow felt twice as warm. Richard had never actually cooked in the old place. That had been Elena's domain. The toast popped up, blackened around the edges. Richard frowned. "I think I broke it," he muttered, poking at the charred bread. A giggle came from behind him. Lonnie stood in the doorway, still in her cloud-patterned pajamas, her curly hair wild from sleep. "Mommy used to do that too," she said, patting into the kitchen. "She said toast tastes better with black edges." Richard felt that familiar tightness in his chest, the bittersweet ache that came whenever Lonnie shared memories of Ariel. "Did she now?" he asked, setting the burnt toast on a plate. "Well then, I guess I did it right after all." Lonnie climbed onto a stool at the kitchen island. "Can I have peanut butter?" Richard found the jar and spread a thick layer on the toast. He made another piece for himself, burning it just the same. They sat together at the island, crunching their breakfast in comfortable silence. The doorbell rang just as they finished eating. Marcus stood on the porch holding a leafy plant in a ceramic pot. His expression was softer than it had been months ago. The hard edges of anger had smoothed into something like cautious friendship. "Housewarming gift," he said, stepping inside. His eyes took in the modest entryway, the boxes still stacked in corners. "Nice place." "Uncle Marcus," Lonnie ran to him, wrapping her arms around his legs. Marcus ruffled her hair. "Hey kiddo, how's the new house?" "Daddy burned the toast," she reported seriously. Marcus set the plant down on a side table and grinned at Richard. "Now it's official," he said. "You're domesticated." Richard rolled his eyes but couldn't hide his smile. "I'll have you know I'm considering taking cooking classes." "Start with toast," Marcus suggested, following them into the kitchen. While the adults talked, Lonnie retrieved her crayons and paper from a box labeled "Lonnie's Important Stuff" in Elena's careful handwriting. She spread her supplies across the kitchen island and began to draw. Richard watched her as she worked, her small face scrunched in concentration. Line by line, a story emerged on the paper, colorful stick figures against simple backgrounds. "What are you drawing?" he asked. "My new life comic strip," she answered without looking up. "See? This is the bus stop where you found me." She pointed to the first panel, carefully labeled in wobbly letters. "Once upon a rainstorm." Richard leaned closer, his throat tightening as he recognized their story taking shape through a child's eyes. There was the penthouse, the sky house. There was Elena. There was Marcus. And there was Richard himself, drawn taller than everyone else with a smile that took up half his face. When she finished, Lonnie held up the paper. "Want to write the ending with me?" she asked. Richard looked at his daughter, at Marcus, at the sunlit kitchen of their new home. "The ending?" he said softly. "I think we're just getting started." After a while, life settled into a gentle rhythm. The boxes were unpacked, pictures hung, and routines established. Their modest home near Lonnie's school became a real home, filled with crayon drawings on the refrigerator, mismatched throw pillows, and the occasional burnt breakfast. Lonnie Carter excelled in school. Her teacher sent notes home praising her creativity and kindness. Richard kept every single one in a folder labeled "Proud Dad Stuff." "Can Jasmine come over after school?" Lonnie asked one morning, bouncing on her toes at the breakfast table. Richard looked up from his coffee. "Jasmine? My best friend. She sits next to me and has barrettes shaped like butterflies." That afternoon, Richard found himself awkwardly welcoming a tiny girl with butterfly clips in her hair and her mother into their home. It was Lonnie's first play date, and Richard had spent the morning frantically cleaning and buying snacks he hoped kids would like. "The girls will be fine," Jasmine's mother assured him with a knowing smile. "First playdate jitters are for parents, not kids." She was right. The girls disappeared into Lonnie's room, their giggles floating down the hallway while Richard pretended he wasn't nervously checking on them every 15 minutes. Parenting, Richard discovered, was a daily lesson in humility. There were bedtime arguments, but why can't I stay up until 9? Homework help that tested his patience. Daddy, that's not how Ms. Wilson showed us. And the surprisingly complex art of packing the perfect lunchbox. One Tuesday at the foundation office, Richard sat across from a young woman with tired eyes and determined shoulders. She clutched a sleeping toddler against her chest. "I just need somewhere safe for a few months," she explained. "I've got a job lined up, but the apartment fell through and the shelter's full." Richard nodded, pen poised over paperwork. Then he froze. Her words echoed a passage from Ariel's journal. "Sometimes all you need is a safe place to catch your breath before you can run again." "Excuse me," he said, rising suddenly. He walked to his assistant's desk. "Call a meeting. I want to create an emergency housing program, short-term apartments for families in transition." His staff gathered quickly, notepads ready. "We'll call it the Ariel Bennett Safe Harbor Program," Richard announced. "Fully furnished units, 3-month stays, with support services on site." That night after dinner, Lonnie pulled a book from her backpack. "I can read this all by myself now," she announced proudly. In her bedroom, she patted the space beside her on the bed. Richard settled in, expecting to listen. Instead, Lonnie opened the book and began reading to him, her finger tracing under each word. "Once upon a time, there was a bear who lived all alone." Halfway through the story, Richard let his eyes drift closed, his breathing deepening. He wasn't really asleep, just giving Lonnie the chance to be the one taking care of someone else for a change. When she finished the story, Lonnie gently closed the book. She leaned over and placed a soft kiss on Richard's forehead. "Sweet dreams, Daddy," she whispered. Richard kept his eyes closed, but his heart was wide awake. The next morning, Richard woke before dawn. He tiptoed into Lonnie's room with armfuls of supplies: paintbrushes, rollers, tarps, and cans of paint in midnight blue, silver, and soft purple. He carefully moved her furniture away from the wall across from her bed, the one she saw first thing every morning. By the time sunlight began filtering through the curtains, Richard had already painted the background, a deep blue canvas stretching across the entire wall. He was so focused on carefully adding tiny silver stars that he didn't notice Lonnie stirring. "Daddy?" Lonnie rubbed her eyes, sitting up in bed. "What are you doing?" Richard turned, paintbrush in hand, a smudge of blue on his cheek. "Good morning, sweetheart. I wanted to surprise you." Lonnie climbed out of bed and padded across the floor, her eyes widening as she took in the half-finished mural. Tiny stars twinkled against the midnight blue background, and Richard had begun adding flowing musical notes that danced across the wall like a gentle breeze. "This is for your dreams," he said softly, kneeling beside her. "And for Mommy's song." Lonnie reached out, her fingers hovering just above the still wet paint. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Want to help?" Richard offered her a small brush. Together, they spent the morning painting stars and notes, Richard lifting Lonnie up to reach the higher spots. By lunchtime, the wall had transformed into a night sky filled with music, Ariel's lullaby made visible. Later that afternoon, they walked hand in hand through the community fair at Laney's school. Colorful booths lined the playground, selling crafts and treats. Children darted between games while parents chatted in small groups. "Mr. Dalton," called Ms. Wilson, Lonnie's teacher, waving them over. "So glad you both could make it." Lonnie tugged Richard toward a group of children and adults. "This is Jasmine and her mom," she said, pointing to her friend with the butterfly clips. Then she turned to a boy with glasses. "And this is Tyler and his dad." The parents smiled politely, introducing themselves. Then Lonnie did something that made Richard's heart stop. "This is my daddy," she announced proudly, looking up at Richard with complete trust in her eyes. For a moment, Richard couldn't speak. After years of introducing himself as Richard Dalton, CEO, or Mr. Dalton, the simplicity of this new identity, Lonnie's father, overwhelmed him. His throat tightened with emotion. Lonnie squeezed his hand, perhaps sensing his struggle. Richard cleared his throat and smiled. "I'm Lonnie's dad," he said, the words feeling both strange and perfectly right on his lips. As the afternoon sun began to lower, they walked home together, Lonnie skipping occasionally with a balloon tied to her wrist. "Daddy?" she asked suddenly, her pace slowing. "Can we visit Mommy's grave?" Richard stopped walking. They hadn't yet visited Ariel's final resting place together. He'd been there alone, but never with Lonnie. "Yes," he said gently. "I think it's time. She's waiting for us." Lonnie nodded solemnly, then slipped her small hand back into his. "I want to tell her about our stars." At that moment, standing before Ariel's grave with flowers and Lonnie's drawing, Richard felt a weight both heavy and somehow lighter than before. The cemetery was peaceful in the late afternoon, with golden sunlight filtering through the trees. Birds sang softly in the distance. Ariel's headstone was simple but elegant, just like she had been in life. Richard held Lonnie's hand as they approached. He carried a bouquet of wildflowers, the kind Ariel used to pick during their walks in college. Lonnie clutched her drawing, carefully protected in a clear plastic sleeve. "Is this where Mommy sleeps?" Lonnie asked, her voice small but steady. Richard nodded, swallowing hard. "Yes, sweetheart. This is where we come to talk to her." They stood in silence for a moment. The wind rustled through the leaves overhead, almost like a whisper. Richard placed the flowers at the base of the headstone, arranging them carefully. "I brought something else," he said, reaching into his jacket pocket. His fingers trembled slightly as he pulled out Ariel's letter, the one he'd found in Lonnie's teddy bear. He'd read it countless times since that night, but this felt different. This was bringing her words home. Richard knelt down on the grass, bringing himself to Lonnie's height. He unfolded the letter, the paper worn at the creases from repeated readings. He cleared his throat and read the final line aloud. "You'll be a good man someday if you let love lead you." His voice cracked on the last words. Tears welled in his eyes, but he didn't wipe them away. He didn't need to hide them anymore. Lonnie stepped forward, her small shoulders squared with purpose. She carefully placed her drawing at the headstone, 3 figures standing beneath a star-filled sky. There was Richard, tall with his serious face but smiling. There was Lonnie holding his hand. And there, between them, was Ariel, drawn from the photos Lonnie had seen, her face bright and loving. "We came back," Lonnie whispered to the stone. She reached out and touched her mother's name, tracing the letters with her small fingers. "Daddy found me, just like you wanted." Richard watched his daughter, amazed at her strength, her gentleness. She was so much like Ariel. The same quiet grace, the same way of seeing beauty in broken things. "I think she'd be proud of you," Richard said softly. Lonnie looked up at him. "Of both of us," she corrected. Richard nodded, unable to speak for a moment. He placed his hand on the cool stone of Ariel's headstone. "I'm sorry I wasn't there," he whispered. "I'm sorry I walked away. But I promise you I'll never walk away from her." They stayed for a while longer, Lonnie telling her mother about the star mural, about her new school, about the teddy bear that still sat on her bed. Richard listened, occasionally adding details, but mostly just watching the beautiful, impossible miracle that was his daughter. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Richard knew it was time to go. He stood up slowly, his knees stiff from kneeling on the ground. "Ready?" he asked Lonnie. She nodded, taking one last look at the headstone and her drawing. "Bye, Mommy," she said. "We'll come back soon." As they walked away hand in hand down the cemetery path, Lonnie looked up at Richard. "Do you think she can see us?" Richard looked up at the sky where the first evening star had just appeared. The same stars they had painted on Lonnie's wall that morning. The same stars that had watched over all of them. "She's not gone," he said gently. "She's just where we can't see her." Lonnie squeezed his hand. "Like the stars during daytime?" Richard smiled, surprised by her wisdom. "Exactly like that. Always there, even when we can't see them." As they reached the cemetery gates, Richard felt something shift inside him, like the final piece of a puzzle falling into place. For years, he had chased success, wealth, power, believing they would fill the emptiness inside him. But here, with his daughter's hand in his, he finally understood what Ariel had meant in her letter. Love had led him here. Love had found him even when he hadn't been looking for it. And love would lead him forward. Eventually, the Ariel Bennett Foundation grew beyond Richard's initial vision. What had started as a single office in their city expanded to 5 major metropolitan areas within 3 years. Each location offered emergency housing, job placement assistance, and childcare for single parents facing hardship. The foundation became known for its personal approach, treating each family with dignity rather than as statistics. Richard kept himself deliberately in the background. He provided the funding and strategic guidance, but insisted that Ariel's name and story remain at the forefront. This wasn't about his redemption anymore. It was about her legacy. Lonnie, now 9 years old, blossomed in these years. Her artistic talents flourished, and she developed a quiet confidence that reminded Richard more of Ariel every day. When a documentary filmmaker approached the foundation to create a short film about its impact, Lonnie volunteered to speak about her mother. "My mom was brave," Lonnie said to the camera, sitting cross-legged in her bedroom with the star mural behind her. "She didn't have much, but she gave me everything. That's what family means, giving everything even when you don't have much." The 15-minute documentary, titled Ariel's Song, premiered at a small film festival and quickly went viral online. Schools began using it in family studies programs, and requests for Lonnie to speak at events poured in. Richard carefully filtered these, protective of his daughter's privacy while supporting her desire to honor her mother. On a crisp autumn evening, Lonnie's school held its annual poetry night. The gymnasium was transformed with soft lighting and rows of folding chairs. Parents clutched programs and whispered excitedly as children took turns at the microphone. Richard sat in the front row, his tie loosened after a long day at the foundation office. Marcus Bennett slipped into the seat beside him, just as the principal announced Laney's name. "Just made it," Marcus whispered. "Traffic was terrible." Richard nodded, grateful for Marcus's presence. Over the years, their relationship had evolved from tense adversaries to something like family. Marcus had become a constant in their lives, a bridge to Ariel's memory and a steadying influence for both Richard and Laney. Laney walked to the center of the stage, her braided hair adorned with small star clips that caught the light. She wore a simple blue dress, Ariel's favorite color. She took a deep breath and looked directly at Richard and Marcus before beginning. "This poem is called Second Chances," she said, her voice clear and steady in the microphone. She spoke of broken promises and mended hearts, of empty bus stops and warm kitchens. Her words painted pictures of loss and discovery, woven together with the wisdom of a child who had experienced both. The gymnasium fell completely silent when she reached the final stanza. "Sometimes the person who left is the one who learns how to stay. Sometimes the heart that was broken is the one that loves the strongest. Sometimes second chances are the only chances that matter." Richard felt tears slide down his cheeks, unashamed. Beside him, Marcus squeezed his shoulder in silent understanding. When Lonnie finished, the room erupted in applause. Parents and teachers stood, many wiping away tears of their own. Later that evening, the three of them sat around the kitchen table in Richard's home, no longer new but lived in and warm with memories. Takeout containers from Lonnie's favorite Italian restaurant covered the surface as they laughed and talked. "You should have seen your father's face when you finished that poem," Marcus told Lonnie, grinning. "I thought he was going to flood the gymnasium." "Hey now," Richard protested with a smile. "You weren't exactly dry-eyed yourself." Lonnie giggled, twirling pasta on her fork. "Ms. Peterson said I should submit it to the citywide competition." "You absolutely should," Marcus said. "Your mother was always writing poetry, you know. She had notebooks full of it in college." "Really?" Lonnie's eyes widened. "Do you still have any of them?" "I might," Marcus said thoughtfully. "I'll look through the boxes in my storage unit this weekend." Richard watched them, marveling at how naturally they had become a family of sorts. Marcus, once his harshest critic, was now the uncle figure Lonnie adored. They shared stories of Ariel that Richard had never known, keeping her memory alive in ways he couldn't have managed alone. As dinner wound down, Richard opened a bottle of sparkling cider and poured 3 glasses. He raised his in a toast. "To Ariel," he said softly, "the girl who taught us all how to come home." "To Mom," Lonnie echoed, lifting her glass. "To Ariel," Marcus added, his voice warm with memory. "Who would be so proud of what we've built together?" Their glasses clinked in the kitchen light, the sound like a musical note hanging in the air, another verse of Ariel's song. At dusk, the sky turned a gentle orange-pink as Richard and Laney strolled along the winding path of Cedar Park. The trees cast long shadows across the grass, and the evening air carried the sweet scent of blooming flowers. Richard walked with his hands in his pockets, his stride slower than his usual businessman's pace. Beside him, Lonnie skipped occasionally, pausing to examine interesting rocks or wave at passing dogs. "This is my favorite time of day," Lonnie said, looking up at the streaks of color painting the sky. "Mom used to say that dusk is when magic happens." Richard smiled down at her. "Your mother was right about a lot of things." They reached a small wooden bridge that arched over a narrow stream. Lonnie leaned against the railing, watching the water ripple below. Her reflection wavered in the gentle current, and she grew quiet, thoughtful. "Back then," she said suddenly, her voice soft, "I was always cold." Richard's heart squeezed tight in his chest. He knew back then meant those terrible days when Lonnie had been alone at the bus stop, when Ariel was gone and he hadn't yet found his daughter. "I remember being hungry a lot," Lonnie continued, her eyes fixed on the water, "and scared, especially at night." Richard moved closer, placing his hand gently on her shoulder. He didn't rush to fill the silence with empty comfort. He'd learned that sometimes Lonnie just needed to speak her memories aloud to make peace with them. "What do you think would have happened?" she asked, turning her face up to his. "If you hadn't stopped that night, if your car just kept going?" The question hung between them, heavy with what-ifs. Richard had asked himself the same thing countless times over the past year. "I think about that every single day," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. He knelt down on one knee so they were eye to eye. "I was seconds away from telling the driver to keep going. Seconds." "What made you stop?" Lonnie's eyes were wide and curious. Richard thought back to that snowy night, to the strange pull he'd felt, a tug on his conscience he couldn't explain. "I don't know exactly," he said honestly. "Something wouldn't let me leave. Maybe it was your mother, watching over both of us. Maybe it was that lullaby you were humming." Lonnie smiled at that. "Mom's song." "Mom's song," Richard agreed. "But you know what I believe now? I believe second chances are miracles in disguise." "What's a miracle in disguise?" Lonnie asked, her forehead wrinkling. "It means something wonderful that doesn't look wonderful at first." Richard reached into his jacket pocket. "Like a cold, rainy night that turns out to be the most important night of your life. Or a scared businessman who turns out to be a dad after all." Lonnie giggled and the sound warmed Richard's heart like nothing else could. "I have something for you," he said, pulling out a small velvet box. "It's not your birthday or anything special, but sometimes gifts don't need a reason." Lonnie's eyes widened as Richard opened the box. Inside, nestled against dark blue velvet, was a silver pendant on a delicate chain. The pendant was shaped like a musical note, with tiny stars engraved along its curve. It caught the fading light and seemed to glow. "It's beautiful," Lonnie whispered, reaching out to touch it with one finger. "Turn it over," Richard said softly. Lonnie carefully lifted the pendant and flipped it over. On the back were engraved the words, "A lullaby is forever." "A lullaby is forever," Richard repeated, his voice thick with emotion. "So are you and me." Tears filled Lonnie's eyes, but they were the kind that came with smiles. She threw her arms around Richard's neck, hugging him so tightly he almost lost his balance. "I love you, Daddy," she whispered against his shoulder. Richard closed his eyes, holding his daughter close as the last light of day surrounded them. He remembered the cold, empty penthouse that had once been his life. The meetings, the deals, the lonely nights. None of it compared to this, to the miracle of finding his daughter, of becoming the father he never thought he could be. "I love you too, baby girl," he said, his voice steady and true. "Forever and always." They stayed that way for a long moment. Father and daughter embraced on the bridge as dusk deepened around them. The pendant hung between them, catching the last rays of sunlight. A small, shining symbol of the bond that had grown between them, of music and memory and love that would never end. At dawn, Richard sat at his desk, fingers poised over his laptop keyboard. The manuscript was complete, 342 pages chronicling a journey that had begun with abandonment and ended with redemption. He typed the final words, then leaned back in his chair, emotions washing over him like gentle waves. Whispers of the Heart, read the title page. Beneath it, for Ariel, who taught me how to love, and for Lainey, who taught me how to stay. Richard ran his fingers over the dedication, remembering the cold businessman he'd once been. How far he had come from that empty penthouse, from the man who had almost driven past a shivering little girl at a bus stop. 3 months later, the first copies arrived. Richard held the hardcover book in his hands, its jacket showing a teddy bear beside a bus stop bench under a starlit sky. He thumbed through the pages, his heart full. "Is that really our story?" Lonnie asked, peering over his arm. At 8 years old now, she was taller, her eyes wiser, but her smile remained the same. "Every word," Richard answered, handing her a copy. "Our story deserves to be told." In the following weeks, boxes of books arrived at women's shelters, children's homes, and libraries across the city. The Ariel Bennett Foundation made sure that anyone who needed hope could find it within those pages. Richard declined the talk show invitations and book tours. This wasn't about fame or redemption in the public eye. It was about legacy, about making sure Ariel's love continued to change lives long after she was gone. On a bright Tuesday morning, Richard sat in the back of Lonnie's third-grade classroom. The teacher had invited him for their Community Heroes Day, but Richard insisted that Lonnie be the one to share their story. The classroom fell silent as Lonnie stood before her classmates, holding the book with careful hands. Her voice was clear and strong as she opened to the first page. "This story begins with a mistake," she read, "but it ends with love." Richard watched his daughter's confident posture, the way the other children leaned forward to listen. Pride swelled in his chest. Lonnie wasn't just surviving her past. She was transforming it into wisdom that could light the way for others. That evening, as twilight settled over their neighborhood, Richard and Lonnie sat on the porch swing of their modest home. The first stars were appearing in the darkening sky, like tiny beacons of light in the vastness. Neither spoke. Words weren't needed anymore. The gentle creak of the swing marked time as they rocked back and forth, their shoulders touching. Lonnie began to hum softly, the familiar notes of Ariel's lullaby rising into the evening air. After a moment, Richard joined in, his deeper voice harmonizing with his daughter's. The melody drifted around them, connecting past to present, absence to presence. A soft breeze rustled through the trees, carrying the scent of jasmine from the garden Lonnie had planted in Ariel's memory. Somewhere in the distance, a wind chime tinkled. Richard closed his eyes, feeling the weight of his daughter against his side. The memoir was complete, but their story continued with each passing day. The greatest chapters were the quiet ones, like this moment, where nothing was said, but everything was understood. The lullaby ended, but its echo remained in their hearts as they sat together under the canopy of stars, father and daughter, two souls who had found each other against all odds. If you enjoyed the story of Richard and Lonnie, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch. If you enjoyed the story of Richard and Lonnie, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.